In the days before cars, smartphones, or washing machines, life in medieval England was no picnic. The roads were muddy, the food was simple, and doing laundry meant hauling buckets of cold water from the nearest stream and hoping the goats didn't run off with your only clean shirt. But for some boys born into noble families, life held the promise of something more exciting than tending pigs or baking flat, tasteless bread. These boys might grow up to become knights, the armored warriors of the medieval world. They would spend their days training with swords, riding war horses, and dreaming of glory on the battlefield. Or at least surviving long enough to eat dinner without losing a tooth. Knighthood was more than shiny armor and tournaments. It was a way of life, built on duty, loyalty, and the complex rules of chivalry. Knights were expected to protect their lords, serve their kings, defend the church, and if they had any time left, maybe write a love poem or two to a lady they'd probably never marry. Life was rarely as noble as the songs and stories made it sound. In truth, the life of a knight was tough, dangerous, and full of uncertainty. To truly understand this world, there is no better guide than William Marshal, a real man who lived during the heart of the Middle Ages, and who became known as the greatest knight that ever lived. Unlike the imaginary heroes of fairy tale, William Marshal's life was recorded in careful detail by his own contemporaries. He wasn't born into greatness. In fact, as the fourth son of a minor noble, young William had no inheritance, no lands, and no reason to expect much more than a quiet life in someone else's castle kitchen. But through skill, courage, and a little luck, William Marshal rose higher than almost anyone of his time. He fought in tournaments, served 4 kings of England, led armies in battle, and toward the end of his life, became the ruler of the kingdom in all but name. And when he finally died at the remarkable age of 72, he was praised as the very model of knighthood. So how did a penniless boy from the wilds of England become the most famous knight of the medieval world? To find out, we need to journey back to the 12th century, a world of castles and kings, of feasts and famines, brutal war, and delicate courtly manners. A world where becoming a knight wasn't a choice, it was survival. This is the true story of William Marshal, the greatest knight in medieval England. Back then, being born into a noble family wasn't exactly a guarantee of comfort or joy, unless you liked cold stone rooms, bland food, and a life plan made for you before you could even walk. But for those destined to become knights, the path was set before the cradle even cooled. William Marshal was born around 1147 as the 4th son of John Marshal, a minor noble who was involved in a civil war between Empress Matilda and King Stephen following the death of King Henry I, during the period of civil war known as the Anarchy. In those days, 4th sons didn't get much. The first son got the estate, the second might get a church job, the third, perhaps some scraps. The fourth, well, he got a horse and a sword, or if unlucky, an early grave. William, it seemed, was born for the latter, or so everyone thought. You see, during one siege at Newbury Castle, when William was still a small boy, his father was caught in a tricky spot. King Stephen besieged the castle and demanded hostages to guarantee peace, including little William. You'd think this would have earned the boy some sympathy from his father. No. When Stephen threatened to hang the boy if John Marshal broke his word, John famously shrugged and said, "I have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still better sons." So there you have it, parenting 12th century style. Not exactly the cuddliest dad in England. Lucky for William, King Stephen took pity and didn't string him up like laundry on a castle wall. It was the first of many escapes young William would enjoy in his lifetime. Medieval England wasn't all glittering armor and grand tournaments. It was mostly mud. Mud in the streets, mud in the fields, mud on your boots, and sometimes mud in your soup. William Marshal was born into a minor noble family. The world at that time was sharply divided, and at the bottom, by far the largest part, were the peasants. These poor souls made up nearly 90% of the population, and they were the real engine that kept medieval society going, though they hardly ever got thanked for it. Their life was simple, exhausting, and dirt-covered. Each day began at dawn, because if you didn't start working the moment the sun came up, you probably wouldn't finish everything needed just to stay alive. No alarm clocks were needed. The rooster and the cold air did the job quite well. Peasants labored on land they didn't own, farming fields that belonged to some lord who might never have even set foot there. They plowed with wooden tools, prayed for good weather, and hoped the tax collector wouldn't darken their door. Because when the taxman came to visit, it was rarely good news. These collectors were often as welcome as a hole in the roof. They'd arrive with lists, demands, and the authority to seize grain, animals, or even tools if payments were late. Sometimes they brought men-at-arms to make sure no one forgot to hand over their due. Resistance was pointless. If you argued too hard, you could lose more than just your harvest. You could lose your land, or even your freedom. Their daily menu rarely changed. Coarse, dark bread made from grain ground between heavy stones, which meant that every bite contained a little bit of grit from the mill itself. It was a perfect way for slowly sanding down your teeth. Dinner, if you could call it that, was usually some watery vegetable soup flavored with hopes and a pinch of salt if they could afford it. Meat was rare, and when it did appear on the table, it was usually because something on the farm had dropped dead of old age or disease, not because of any grand hunting feast. Bath time? What bath time? Soap was a luxury meant for nobles and monks. Peasants were lucky if they could rinse their faces in the nearest stream, unless the pigs got there first, in which case it was back to wiping with a rag and calling it good enough. Clothes were rarely washed, and fleas were simply part of life. Still, life wasn't all misery. There were feast days, rare breaks from labor, where the village gathered for dancing, music, and mugs of weak ale. And there was always gossip, the medieval equivalent of social media, passed from neighbor to neighbor faster than the wind. But make no mistake, for the peasantry, life was hard, survival was uncertain, and the world of knights, castles, and grand tournaments was as far away as the moon. Then there were the nobles, the few, the privileged, and the usually well-fed. For these nobles, life was better, but not free of worries. They ate more meat, drank real ale or wine, and owned clothing made from fine wool, or even imported linen. But baths still rare. At least they could afford perfume to cover up the scent, unlike their unfortunate peasants. But even among nobles, there were ranks. At the very top sat the great barons and earls, the true power brokers of the realm. These were not men who sweated in fields or sharpened plows. They commanded entire counties from their stone fortresses, lounging by roaring hearths, while servants ran about fetching goblets of wine and plates of roasted meat. The good kind, not the stringy scraps the peasants gnawed on. Their daily worries were far removed from mud, weather, and broken hose. Instead, They spent long hours pondering far grander matters, such as royal favor, wondering nervously if the king actually liked them this week, or if he had shot them that cold, dangerous glare in court again. Their mind was also occupied with marriages, carefully plotting which daughter to marry off to gain more land, or forge an alliance with that scheming neighbor. And of course, the ever-present fear that the king might suddenly decide to confiscate their estates. Something kings, especially the poorer ones, were quite fond of doing. The homes of the great barons and the earls, the castles, were grand and impressive, but also cold, drafty, and impossible to heat properly, even with the biggest fireplaces roaring. Not that this stopped them from boasting endlessly about the size of their great halls or the thickness of their stone walls. In medieval politics, having the largest hall or the sturdiest gatehouse was as much a bragging right as any heroic battlefield deed. They dressed in fine clothes, some edged with real fur, and dined on roast pork, venison, or swan if they felt especially grand. They washed these meals down with strong ale or wine imported from France, though this supply could dry up fast whenever the two countries went to war, which, frankly, was pretty often. But life at the top wasn't all feasting and falconry. These nobles juggled endless responsibilities, managing sprawling estates, settling petty arguments between vassals, and dispensing justice, usually by deciding who got fined and who got tossed into the stocks for public shame. And then there were the king's demands, summons to provide soldiers for yet another exhausting campaign across the Channel. Refusing wasn't really an option, unless you wanted to lose your lands or worse, your head. For all the risks and burdens, the life of the great noble was still far removed from the grinding misery of the peasantry, a world filled with plots, privileges, and luxury, with just enough danger to keep things interesting. Below the grand barons and earls were the lesser nobles, the knights and small lords, folk like William Marshal's own family. These men were the middle managers of medieval England, forever caught between the burdens of duty above and the grumbling peasants below. They might own a manor or two, a modest patch of farmland, perhaps even an entire village, but not enough wealth to live in idle luxury, sipping wine all day and hiring minstrels to sing about their greatness. No, these were working nobles, the sort who polished their own helmets when the squire was busy chasing chickens. They could afford proper armor, but probably only one good set. And if that set got dented in a tournament or battered in a scuffle, well, that was just too bad. No budget for spares. A war horse might also be part of their small fortune, but keeping such a beast alive through the harsh English winter was another headache. Horses, you see, eat like, well, horses, and a bad harvest could leave both lord and beast miserably thin by spring. Their homes were more respectable than the peasants' smoky huts, of course. Stone walls, a wooden roof that hopefully didn't leak too much, and a real hall with a fire in the middle. Their beds were raised off the ground, a true medieval luxury, as this meant not waking up face to face with rats or the family dog. But comfort was relative. These halls were cold in winter, smoky in summer, and always noisy with the clatter of servants, visiting neighbors, and the occasional stray pig that wandered indoors. Despite their status, lesser nobles spent plenty of time worrying about taxes from the king, demands from their overlords, and bad harvests, which was guaranteed to happen every third year. Also, how to keep the peasants from either starving or rebelling. If the peasants got too hungry, they might revolt. If they ate too well, they might get ideas above their station. It was a delicate balance, one that required the lesser lord to play both stern master and reluctant benefactor. And then there were local disputes to settle. Whose cow wandered onto whose land, who was cheating at the village market, and who had insulted whose wife in church last Sunday. Every small feud or argument ended up on the Lord's doorstep sooner or later, dragging him away from important business, like repairing his rusty sword or daydreaming about marrying a wealthier heiress. So while they held titles, these small lords and knights rarely knew the ease and splendor of the great barons. Their life was a juggling act of duty, debt, and damage control, made bearable only by the occasional feast, the thrill of a tournament, or the hope that one day their fortunes might rise perhaps by serving a king, or winning glory on the battlefield, as William Marshal himself would one day do. The difference between noble and peasant was more than money. It was a matter of birth, of education, and of expectation. Nobles might learn to read Latin or French. Peasants learned how not to starve. Nobles trained for war. Peasants trained to survive the winter. But there was one thing they all shared: the constant worry of the medieval world. Disease, famine, war. No one, not even the richest baron, was safe from the dangers of the age. Into this sharply divided, often dangerous but deeply structured world, William Marshal was born. A fourth son in a minor noble family with little money, but big hopes. He was destined to become a knight, but the road there would be long, hard, and full of unexpected turns. Becoming a knight in medieval England wasn't as simple as picking up a sword and yelling for the king. It was a long, painful process that started when a boy was barely out of diapers. Young William Marshal's journey toward knighthood began early. Like most noble sons not set for the church, he was practically handed over to another lord's household around the tender age of 7. Why so young? Because medieval nobles didn't believe in letting boys waste time being boys. Childhood was for learning how not to get killed, or worse, how not to embarrass your family name in front of the king. At this stage, the boy became a page, the lowest rung in the knightly ladder. Pages learned the basics: how to serve at table, which required knowing how to pour wine without splashing the lord's lap; how to clean armor, which were heavy, greasy, and almost always smelly; and how to care for horses, who had minds of their own and occasionally tried to bite. It wasn't all chores, though. Pages also learned to read and write, if they were lucky, or at least how to recognize the important things: family crests, banners, and shields, the medieval world's version of ID cards. Why were these so important? Because on a battlefield crowded with knights in identical shining armor, you couldn't just spot a friend by his haircut. Every noble family had its own coat of arms, a unique design painted on shields, sewn onto banners, or stitched onto tunics. Some had lions, others had crosses, eagles, dragons, or odd geometric patterns. A sharp-eyed page was expected to learn these symbols early, because mistaking a friend for a foe, or worse, failing to bow properly when the king's banner passed, could cost you more than embarrassment. It could cost your life, or at least earn you a nasty cuff on the ear. These heraldic devices were not just for the battlefield either. They marked tents at tournaments, decorated castle halls, and sealed letters and official documents. A knight's banner told everyone who he was, who he served, and how noble, or not so noble, his family was. Even the peasants knew some of these great symbols. They knew which lord's banner meant extra taxes were coming, or which passing army might seize their chickens. So young William Marshal wasn't just memorizing pretty pictures, he was learning to read the language of power. In a world where everyone from the king to the lowliest hedge knight wore their family's identity stitched onto their tunics or painted on their shields, knowing these symbols was vital. One glance could tell you whether a rider approaching the road was a friend bearing good news, or a rival lord who'd sooner shove a lance through your chest than offer a polite greeting. But these signs meant more than just danger or safety. They meant opportunity. To survive and thrive as a knight, you needed to know who to salute with deep respect, who to gossip with over wine, and who to quietly avoid at all costs. Knowing the right noble house could open doors to a lord's hall, a warm meal, a new horse, or if you were truly lucky, a place in a noble household as a squire or retainer. In William's future career, this early skill of reading the signs of nobility and judging who held power would prove just as valuable as his sword or shield. After all, a knight without connections was like a minstrel with no audience, destined to sing alone in a field, probably for the cows. Medieval life, especially among the knightly class, was one great game of alliances, favors, and carefully chosen friendships. Many knights before William had risen or fallen, based on their ability to network rather than just fight. Take Sir William Fitzosborne, for example, a loyal supporter of William the Conqueror. Thanks to his close friendship and service to the king, he was rewarded with vast estates in England after the Norman conquest, turning him from a respectable knight into one of the richest men in the land. His sword was sharp, but his sense of who to serve and when was sharper. Or consider Robert Guiscard, the Norman adventurer who began as a landless knight in Normandy, but through clever alliances and well-timed military service in southern Italy, became Duke of Apulia and Calabria. His success was as much about shaking the right hands and backing the right claimants to thrones as it was about swinging his sword on the battlefield. For young knights like William Marshal, especially those from modest noble families without great wealth, this web of alliances, favors, and noble connections was their true armor against the harsh world. A good reputation could lead to a generous patron or a wealthy marriage. A bad one could leave you wandering the roads as a sword for hire, forever begging for work. So while little William studied heraldry, the banners of barons, and the crests of counts, he wasn't just memorizing colors and animals. He was learning medieval social media, the Facebook of the 12th century. Hanging out with the right people could give you a better future in the horizon. It was true then as it is now. By his teenage years, William would have become a squire. Now the real fun began. Squires were the medieval equivalent of unpaid interns, but with more bruises. They helped knights don their armor, kept their weapons sharp, and crucially, learned to fight. Sword practice, lance practice, wrestling, riding fast without falling off, shooting arrows straight, and every day ended with more chores. Shine the armor, muck the stables, keep the lord's gear spotless, unless you wanted a wooden practice sword cracked across your back for sloppiness. But training a knight wasn't just about weapons. A good knight needed manners because insulting a duke over dinner could get you thrown out of court faster than you could draw your blade. And they also needed dancing skills because for all the clanging and crashing of tournaments, the real victories sometimes happened later in the feast hall. After all, what use was showing off your shiny armor and bruised ribs if you couldn't charm a lady or two when the music started? Stomping about like an angry ox on the dance floor wouldn't win you any noble favors or dinner invitations. You needed to speak French, the language of courts and kings, even if you came from rural England. A knight who couldn't follow orders shouted in French might find himself galloping the wrong way on the battlefield. Or worse, agreeing to polish someone else's boots without realizing it. Why French? The history goes that in year 1066, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy in northern France, crossed the English Channel and beat King Harold at the Battle of Hastings. He made himself King of England, and he didn't bother switching languages. After all, why would he? His court, his nobles, his knights, they were all Norman French speakers. The poor Anglo-Saxon peasants could keep their old English mutterings down in the fields. But in the halls of power, French ruled supreme. The hard work to become a knight could take 10 years or more, and there were no guarantees. Not every squire became a knight. Some washed out. Some died young. Some decided monastery life, quiet, bookish, and lacking swords, was a better option. But William, he pressed on. At last, if the squire survived training, learned his lessons, and proved himself brave in battle or tournament, he could be dubbed a knight. The ceremony was grand, sometimes before a king, often in a church, with prayers, blessings, and, of course, a sharp sword tapping each shoulder. Then you rose, no longer a boy but a man-at-arms, a knight bound by honor, loyalty, and a lifetime of dangerous work. For young William Marshal, and every squire dreaming of knighthood, there came a moment that was half holy ritual, half exhausting ordeal, and all terribly expensive. It was called the dubbing ceremony, the grand solemn event when a man was officially made a knight. In many ways, this moment was like graduating from university, except instead of getting a diploma and a handshake, you got 40 pounds of metal strapped to your chest and the promise of future battles. The process began not on the battlefield, but in the bath. Yes, a bath, something quite rare and luxurious in medieval life, since most people of the time thought washing too often might actually make you ill. But before becoming a knight, a young man was expected to soak thoroughly, scrubbing away the dirt and probably the fleas of squire life. This cleansing wasn't just to make him smell nice for the big day. It was symbolic. The bath represented the washing away of sin, a fresh start. A knight, after all, was supposed to be pure of heart, even if his boots were covered in mud most of the time. Next came a vigil of prayer, an all-night affair spent in quiet reflection. The soon-to-be knight would kneel in a chapel beside his sword and armor, praying for strength, courage, and maybe that his helmet wouldn't fall off in his first real battle. It was a serious spiritual moment. After all, to be a knight wasn't simply to swing a sword. It was a sacred duty. This was followed by confession to a priest, just in case the young squire had committed any unknightly sins in his youth. One wonders how many confessed to stealing extra meat from the kitchens. Then came the grand moment, the ceremony itself. Before a gathering of lords, knights, and expectant family members, the young man was dressed in his armor, a slow, careful process that could take an hour or more and probably required help from several servants. Each piece of equipment had meaning. The sword represented justice, and the knight's role as protector of the innocent. The spurs symbolized duty and service. No spurs, no riding into glory. The lance was bravery, a polite way of saying, you're expected to charge straight at other men holding sharp sticks. Once fully armed, and probably sweating under all that iron, the squire knelt before his lord, who would tap him lightly on the shoulder with the sword, a gesture called the accolade, and proclaim him a knight. Sometimes the tap was gentle. Sometimes, if the lord was feeling theatrical, or the new knight had been annoying in training, it was a good solid whack. And then came the words that sealed the deal, the oath of fealty. This was no simple promise. It was a binding vow to serve his lord and king faithfully, to defend the church, to protect the weak, to uphold justice. In return, the lord promised land, protection, and enough money, in theory, to keep the knight in horses and armor. But knighthood wasn't all glory and tournaments. It came with some serious costs. A full suit of armor, a good sword, a sturdy shield, helmets. Not to mention a fine warhorse called a destrier, the medieval equivalent of a sports car, big and strong enough to carry a man in full armor and still have the energy to trample someone else. All of this could empty a purse faster than a tax collector at harvest time. And unlike fairy tale, these things didn't just fall from the sky or get handed out for free by generous kings. They required land, wealth, or the favor of a rich patron to keep you properly armed, fed, and mounted. Weapons, too, were costly. Swords had to be well forged and kept sharp. Lances broke regularly and needed replacing. And don't forget the endless repairs. Straps broke, mail links popped loose, helmets got dented, sometimes with the knight's head still inside. A knight without money was like a modern student with no job prospects, skilled but broke. This is where the freelance part of knighthood came in, literally. The word freelance comes from this very era. A freelance was a knight not tied to any lord or castle, offering his services and his sharp, well-armored lance to the highest bidder. These wandering swordsmen fought for lords, bishops, or kings, or sometimes for foreign rulers in far-off lands, wherever the pay was good and the food wasn't entirely made of boiled cabbage. If you couldn't afford to keep yourself in the style of a proper knight, you fought as a mercenary, risking your life in sieges and skirmishes, just to earn enough silver to replace your dented helmet or feed your horses. This was a risky business. Mercenary knights were useful, but not always trusted. Some lords viewed them like heavily armed gamblers, loyal only to the size of the purse. But for landless young knights like William Marshal, who at one point in his life fought in tournaments and war just to stay afloat, this was sometimes the only way to make a living or make a name. Of course, the luckiest knights didn't have to worry about any of this. If you were born into a rich family with land, or you caught the eye of a powerful patron, perhaps even the king, you might be granted a castle, an estate, or a lifetime of secure service. But for many, the life of a knight was a constant balancing act between poverty and peril, sharpening your sword with one hand while counting your dwindling coins with the other. For William Marshal, this training would serve him well. Unlike many unlucky squires who faded into history, William would rise higher than any could have guessed, earning fame, fortune, and the trust of kings. Yet, none of this was clear when he was a mud-covered, bruised squire, scrubbing saddles at dawn. When William Marshal was knighted around the age of 20, he didn't step straight into a grand castle or a fine position at court. No one handed him a manor or a chest full of gold. In fact, young William did what many newly made knights of his time were forced to do. He went freelance. He sold his swords and skills to whichever lord or tournament offered the best prospects, or at least some chance of survival and supper. Without a personal estate or a permanent lord to serve, young knights would travel from court to court, castle to castle, looking for employment or tournament invitations, like desperate actors trying to land a role. Tournaments in the 12th century were not the chivalrous, polite affairs Hollywood sometimes likes to show us. They weren't about winning a favor from a lady or showing off sparkling armor under the summer sun. They were brutal, dangerous, all-out melees where teams of knights bashed each other senseless across open fields. The goal? Capture the other knights and ransom them back to their families. Or strip their armor and horses, which you could then sell. William Marshal excelled in this violent sport. He quickly earned a reputation not only for surviving these chaotic contests, but for thriving in them. In fact, tournaments became his personal gold mine. Over a decade, he is said to have participated in more than 500 tournaments, a staggering number that turned him from a landless younger son into a knight of fortune. But life on the tournament circuit wasn't glamorous. Imagine weeks of riding from town to town, your armor battered, your clothes smelling of sweat and mud, and the constant risk of a lance to the face. Horses, weapons, food, a decent bed. None of these were guaranteed for a freelance knight. Only skill, luck, and endurance kept you alive and solvent. There was also real risk. Some knights entered a tournament and left it dead, or worse, broke. Tournaments were expensive. A knight had to invest heavily in his equipment. Lose your horse or your armor in a defeat, and you could end up pawning your sword just to buy food. In that sense, early knighthood was a lot like gambling in Las Vegas, except with more bruises and fewer glittering lights. Still, despite the costs and risks, becoming a knight was one of the greatest honors a man in medieval England could achieve. To ride into battle beneath your own family banner, to wear the crest your ancestors bore, this was to be part of the great story. People bowed to knights. Children looked up to them. Bards sang songs about them. William avoided these pitfalls, thanks to his cleverness and combat skill. He also did something that many desperate freelance knights rarely achieved. He built connections. His success in tournaments earned him the favor of powerful patrons. By the end of his freelancing decade, he wasn't just any wandering knight. He was the tournament champion of Europe. Lords and kings knew his name. Women admired him. Enemies feared him. And potential employers lined up to offer him service. Not bad for the fourth son of a minor noble who had nearly died as a hostage years earlier. After winning fame and fortune on the tournament circuit, William's next step was the royal court, where a knight could either find opportunity or meet an abrupt and sticky end. Fortunately for William, his sense of timing was nearly perfect. By the early 1170s, King Henry II appointed William as tutor-in-arms to his son, Henry the Young King. Now here is the odd part that confuses even some history students. Henry the Young King was crowned king while his father was still very much alive and stubbornly clinging to the real crown. It was like being given a promotion, but no office, no authority, and certainly no kingdom to run. This made Henry the Young King the grandest spare wheel in all of medieval Europe. With no kingdom to govern, young Henry spent his time chasing something much more exciting than tax collection or court politics, which was tournaments. Glorious, dangerous, rowdy tournaments. These were the medieval equivalent of professional sports. Half brutal combat practice, half traveling spectacle, and entirely the way a restless young noble could earn fame without starting a war. Naturally, he gathered a large and rowdy band of knights eager for action, and William Marshal became their star performer. This period gave William more than just gold and reputation. It gave him political connections that would shape the rest of his career. And unlike many knights who dreamed only of battlefield glory, William understood the value of relationships. Every lord who admired his skill, every knight who respected him for not stealing their horse after a defeat, and every court that cheered his victories laid the foundation for his eventual rise to real power. William's skill in the tournaments made him famous at court. He wasn't just surviving these violent contests, he was thriving. In these years, William transitioned from mere survival to genuine prosperity. But his service wasn't limited to mock battles and glory. William also fought in real war skirmishes against rebels, cross-channel campaigns, and the usual small wars that broke out when kings argued over their French possessions. During these chaotic years, he developed a reputation for loyalty, bravery, and importantly, trustworthiness. In a time when many knights might switch sides for a sack of silver, William kept his oaths. His loyalty was tested when his patron, Henry the Young King, died in June 1183 from sickness. On his deathbed, the young king asked William to fulfill the vow that he had made in 1182, to take up the cross and undertake a crusade to the Holy Land. After receiving Henry II's blessing, William left for Jerusalem in late 1183. Henry the Young King was popular during his lifetime, so when William returned to Europe 2 years later, after completing his master's vow, his reputation was stronger than ever. Kings noticed, barons noticed, even rivals grudgingly respected him. Now he was a knight who could shape the fate of kingdoms. Soon, William entered the service of King Henry II himself. The old king, always suspicious of ambitious barons and turncoat vassals, found in William something rare, an honest man with no secret agenda. William served Henry loyally in the endless conflicts against his rebellious sons, including Richard the Lionheart and John. When Henry II died in 1189, William carried the king's cloak at his funeral. His reward? A place in the service of the new king, Richard the Lionheart. Serving King Richard, however, was not what anyone would call restful. Almost as soon as the crown was settled on his head, Richard dashed off on the Third Crusade. As if being King of England was simply a part-time hobby, and the real business lay thousands of miles away, far away in the hills and cities of the Holy Land, battling the formidable Saladin. Very noble, very glorious, but it did rather leave England in a pickle. In fairness, Richard hadn't gone alone. He was accompanied by King Philip of France, his sometimes ally, sometimes rival, which was a clever arrangement in itself. Neither man particularly trusted the other to stay behind and behave. Best, they thought, to march off together to Jerusalem and keep a wary eye on one another under the same sky, rather than leave one king free to gobble up the other's lands back home. After all, what is the point in fighting for the holy city if you return to find your own kingdom missing? And who was left to keep the English kingdom, brimming with restless nobles, squabbling barons, and a royally ambitious younger brother, from falling apart entirely? Why, none other than William Marshal. While Richard was away chasing crusading glory in the Holy Land, Marshal remained in England to manage the far less glamorous, but far more nerve-shredding job of holding the realm together. It was no simple matter of sitting in court, drinking wine, and issuing orders. Marshal had to navigate a political swamp deeper and murkier than the moat at Windsor. Many of the barons, never the most patient or obedient bunch, saw the king's absence as the perfect excuse to ignore royal commands, settle old feuds, or simply grab more power for themselves. Tax collection turned into a national game of hide-and-seek. Law and order hung by a thread, and local disputes between lords threatened to spill into private wars at any moment. Some of the more daring nobles even began stockpiling weapons and raising troops, just in case England descended into open civil war. And hovering over all this mischief was Prince John, clever, slippery, and always sniffing out an opportunity. John was more than ready to snatch the crown for himself if fortune, or an unfortunate accident in the Holy Land, should make the throne conveniently empty. Marshal had to walk the finest of lines. If he pressed the rebellious lords too hard, they might rebel outright. If he let them run free, the kingdom could break apart. Meanwhile, John's schemes grew ever bolder. It was not the work of a knight on horseback, shining and heroic. It was the work of a weary diplomat, a watchful guardian, and occasionally, no doubt, a man who wished everyone would simply grow up and behave. But thanks to Marshal's steady hand, quiet strength, and iron reputation, England held together, just. It wasn't glorious, and no bard ever sang songs about endless council meetings and frustrated negotiations, but it was essential. Without William Marshal, the kingdom could well have torn itself apart before Richard ever set foot on English soil again. At last, after years of costly warfare, Richard reached an uneasy truce with Saladin, a treaty that allowed Christian pilgrims safe access to Jerusalem, but left the city itself in Muslim hands. With this compromise sealed, Richard began the long and dangerous journey home. After leaving the Holy Land in 1192, Richard the Lionheart never made it directly home to England. On his return journey, while traveling through Europe in disguise to avoid his enemies, he was captured near Vienna by Duke Leopold V of Austria, a man Richard had insulted during the Crusade. Leopold handed Richard over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who held him for ransom. The emperor demanded a staggering sum, 150,000 marks, or about 3 times the annual income of the English crown, to release him. In England, this caused a financial and political crisis. The kingdom was heavily taxed, churches stripped of treasures, and royal lands sold to raise the money. Richard was finally released in early 1194, after about 14 months in captivity. He landed in England briefly, but stayed only long enough to restore his authority. Then, knowing his continental empire in France was under threat from Philip, he immediately crossed to Normandy. For the rest of his life, until his death in 1199, Richard focused on defending and rebuilding his French territories, especially his great castles like Chateau Galliard. He spent almost no time ruling in England itself. His heart, energy, and wars were all on the continent. But Richard's restless spirit could not be tamed for long. In 1199, while besieging the small and relatively insignificant castle of Challis in France, he was struck by a crossbow bolt fired by a young defender. At first the wound seemed minor, but infection soon set in. As fever gripped him and death drew near, the great warrior king faced his end, not on the battlefield, but from a festering injury in a petty siege. Richard the Lionheart died on April 6, 1199, leaving the throne to his brother John, and leaving William Marshal to face a new and dangerous chapter in England's troubled history. When King Richard died in 1199, the English crown passed to his younger brother, John. As was expected of a loyal vassal, William Marshal gave his allegiance to the new king without fuss. A knight's duty was to serve the rightful monarch, whatever personal reservations he might have held. And with John, there were plenty of reasons for caution. His reputation for distrust, ambition, and political unpredictability was already well known, even in these early years of his reign. For Marshal, this meant entering yet another difficult chapter of royal service. The court was full of suspicion and shifting loyalties, and John's own decisions only made matters worse. Many of the barons, already weary of heavy taxes and broken promises, grew restless and rebellious. As Marshal of England, William held a central and delicate position. He worked to keep the kingdom stable, acting as a mediator between the crown and the nobility, but even his loyalty was questioned. At one point, John demanded that William surrender several of his castles as proof of his good faith, a serious insult to any nobleman, and not something a proud knight would accept lightly. But Marshal, ever patient and cautious, swallowed the affront and endured, placing the security of the realm above personal pride. But this uncomfortable balancing act soon collapsed into outright disaster. By 1215, John had so thoroughly alienated the English barons that they rebelled in force, kicking off what history would call the First Barons' War. England descended into chaos. Furious nobles invited Prince Louis of France, yes, a French prince, of all people, to come over and claim the English throne. Louis gladly accepted, landed with an army, and began taking castles like a child, picking sweets in a shop. Barons defected. Royal fortresses fell. For a time, it looked as if the crown of England might simply change hands without so much as a proper battle. The royal cause hung by a thread, and in the middle of this slow-moving disaster stood William Marshal. Old now, weary of the endless treachery and chaos, but still the kingdom's best hope for survival. After King John's death in 1216, William Marshal, now well into his 70s, was appointed as regent for the young King Henry III, who was just a child. It was a heavy responsibility for a man of his age, but there was no one else in the kingdom with the authority, respect, or experience to hold the realm together in such troubled times. The following year, in 1217, Marshal led the royal army to face the combined forces of rebel English barons and the invading French army at the Battle of Lincoln. It was a critical moment. The fate of the Plantagenet dynasty and of England itself hung in the balance. If the French and rebel forces won, young Henry's reign could have ended almost before it began, and England risked falling under French control. Despite his age, Marshal took personal command on the field. He planned and led a decisive cavalry assault that broke through the enemy lines. His leadership and example inspired the Royalist knights to press the attack, scattering the opposition and capturing hundreds of men. The victory at Lincoln was not only a military success, it was a turning point. Without it, the fragile regime of the boy king might not have survived, and the political future of England could have been changed forever. By the time he retired from public life, William Marshal was the most respected man in England. A knight who had served 5 kings, survived countless wars, and won the admiration of friend and foe alike. Even chroniclers who usually delighted in mocking the great and powerful had little bad to say about him. He was, as one biographer put it, the greatest knight that ever lived. In 1219, at the remarkable age of around 72, William Marshal finally laid down his sword. For a knight, a man whose life was measured by battles survived and injuries endured, this was a truly ancient age. Most knights died young in war, or from disease, or occasionally from an oops moment at a tournament. Marshal lived long enough to see his grandchildren. On his deathbed, Marshal did what many aging knights dreamed of, but few managed. He took the holy vows of the Knights Templar, those famous warrior monks of the Crusades. Becoming a Templar was believed to offer enormous spiritual benefits. In medieval Christian belief, knights led violent, sinful lives. Killing, pride, greed, and ambition were built into their profession. Taking Templar vows at the very end was a way to clean the slate before facing God, a final act of humility, renouncing wealth and titles and asking for salvation. For a medieval knight, this was the best possible ending, dying not as a rich earl, but as a humble servant of God, prepared for judgment. He could die knowing he had fulfilled every part of the chivalric code: warrior, lord, husband, peacemaker, and finally, servant of God. He was buried in Temple Church in London, the sacred place of the Templars, where his stone effigy still lies today, a weathered knight carved in stone, his hands folded in prayer. Tourists wander past him now, snapping photos, but in his day, that tomb was a symbol of the greatest knight of his age. His sons inherited his lands, but not his lasting greatness. Sadly, they all died without heirs, and his direct line came to an end. But Marshal's name lived on, not in dynasties, but in legend. Chroniclers across Europe wrote about him. Poets sang of him. Even his enemies remembered him as the best knight that ever lived. By the time the 13th and 14th centuries rolled in, the world of the knights was changing fast. Castles got stronger, cities got richer, and most importantly, gunpowder appeared on the battlefield. A knight in armor was no match for a cannonball or a musket shot. The lords who once relied on proud bands of armored horsemen started hiring professional armies instead. Soldiers who didn't need noble blood or a fancy title to fight well. Tournaments turned into pageants. Armor grew heavier, more decorative, and less practical. The great wars of England and France, like the 100 Years' War, would feature longbowmen and foot soldiers, not just armored knights charging with lances. Marshal's world, the age of the true knight, was fading, but in the pages of his life story and in the stone of his tomb, that world still breathes. His life remains a window into the time when honor, courage, and the clash of steel shaped the fate of kingdoms. And as history marched on, leaving the chivalric knight behind, a new era began to dawn. One of merchants, kings with gunpowder, and empires built not on horseback, but on trade, science, and exploration.